If you grew up in China, you didn't just learn that the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling party, won the Civil War. You learned that it was a fight between two equals. I remember watching TV dramas as a kid because those were the only TV shows that were available at that time. And there was always this clear picture. The communist soldiers were always so disciplined, so selfless, never would hurt a fly, let alone an innocent civilian. They are the party for the poor, the party for the farmers. And the nationalist soldiers were corrupt, lazy, out of touch, working for the rich. The worst thing you can think of. It was basically a superhero movie, and we all knew who the heroes were. Never have I thought that the Chinese Communist Party, the great party for the people, was actually a French movement. Tens of thousands of people at most wandering in the wilderness. And what's worse, they were not the party for the people. They were vandalizers. They were reluctant to fight the Japanese army, and the central government, the Nationalist Party, was actually trying to build the country back up only to watch it destroyed over and over again by the Chinese Communist Party. And this matters because the Chinese Communist Party, the current ruling party of the PRC, bases its whole legitimacy, or at least a huge part of its legitimacy, on this premise that they were the one that fought off the Japanese army. And it's simply just not true. Welcome to my channel. My name is Lu. I was born and raised in China. If you like this type of content, make sure that you subscribe. Otherwise, you won't see me again. Let's get into it.
As if the 1920s and 30s are some sort of fight between these two opposite parties. There's no such thing. Absolutely no such thing. The nationalists are established in 1912. After the collapse of the Qing Empire, they are the universally recognized Republic of China. They represent a great many people. They have an army of several million, whereas the communists are really merely tens of thousands wandering around the wilderness from 1927 onwards until at least 1980.
That number right there was never, I guess, compared like that in our textbook. All we heard growing up was this great story of triumph. And I don't think people understand there's something romantic about rooting for the underdog, right? And I was under the impression that the Chinese Communist Party might not have outnumbered the central government, but it is believed that the Chinese Communist Party somehow had the support, the popular support of the people. But when you think about it, if it really did have the support of the people, how come that they were struggling to recruit, right? It almost feels democratic when you think about it. But really, at the end of the day, it sounds like a bloody, violent coup. Maybe that's what it really is.
I think my generation sort of came of age and learned that in a certain sense, maybe the Republican government of Chiang Kai-shek deserved to lose.
Yes.
Because it was so reprobate and so corrupt.
Yes.
How do you look back at that now? Do you think that's an excessive sort of evaluation of their failure, or what do you think?
I'm kind of shocked that was also the story that people in the West believe, because it's identical to the story that I was taught to believe growing up. And that is, there is a reason that the Chinese Communist Party came into power. And it's because the central government was so bad, insufferable, unbearable. I did not know that narrative is also embraced by the West.
These journalists had every freedom to travel around so-called Free China and Chongqing and criticize the government, but they were not able to set foot in Yan'an until 1944. So, for instance, inflation, which is, this Republican government is completely corrupt. There's inflation at every level. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. But the inflation in Yan'an is even higher than it is in Free China. It's higher. In other words, villagers who work under the communist must produce more and sell more for the same amount of money. Inflation is higher. That's hardly ever noticed by historians. The Japanese produce massive amounts of fake currency in order to aggravate the monetary crisis. The Japanese controlled areas are also suffering from inflation. So then corruption, Of course they're corrupt. Who isn't corrupt? In the 1930s or 40s, are they more corrupt than the communists? I doubt that very much.
You know what that reminds me of? That reminds me of the West and these authoritarian regimes. When you think about it, China is still very much closed to the outside world. You cannot use Gmail. You cannot access the free internet, right? You need a license by the government to practice journalism. You cannot post anything online. If you step even a little bit out of line, your account gets banned. There's a limitation of freedom, and criticism is hard when you don't really know what to criticize. And so it creates this, I guess, misunderstanding that somehow the West is worse. And it's the same thing here, right? They kind of protected their little base, Yan'an, and they brush it up, have it on a platter for this journalist and all these foreign media, and try to show them how great Yan'an is, while the rest of the country didn't get to do that. And so somehow people believed that because they forget, as he points out here, that Yan'an is not necessarily better. I think it's really important for people to realize just because you have flaws in democracies, it does not necessarily mean this faraway place is any better.
It does go pear-shaped after 45, and I think the reason is quite straightforward. Here you have a central government that's been holding down several million Japanese soldiers for the Allied powers and has now to reconstruct a country the size of a European continent without very much help at all. But the moment they rebuild a railway, the moment the central government erects a telegraph pole, it gets destroyed by the communists. The communists, all they need to do is wreck and sabotage. Central government has to rebuild and try to rebuild. They have to place troops around major factories to protect them from communist aggression. And then as you move into 46, 47, this whole civil war becomes just impossible to wage. So
the bar for the Chinese Communist Party is so low. What are you going to do when they use unarmed civilians during the Civil War to traumatize their enemies? Are you going to use unarmed civilians to do the same? We can't. And that's what makes them so hard to defeat. The fighters are held against a higher standard, whereas they're expected to be bad. They say they're going to invade Taiwan enough times that most people don't even blink.
Then there is, of course, the constant portrayal of that entity as being somehow democratic and open to the world, when it is exactly the opposite. Now, how many people live in the People's Republic of China? How many foreigners are there? Less than 0.05 is what I used to say, but it's probably less than 0.04. There are more foreign residents in North Korea as a proportion of the overall population than there are in the People's Republic of China. I mean, the number of foreign journalists you can count very easily, right? I think the New York Times just lost yet another one. So yes, we can go back and talk about Chiang Kai-shek in the 1930s and how corrupt it all was, but different entity altogether, I think.
If you go to Shanghai as a foreigner, it could be really advanced. You would see a lot of foreigners, but that is such a fraction of the real China. And the problem with that is people outside China only see the international version of this vast country. And it's more of a problem now with TikTok and all the media companies that are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
There is a great continuity, a sort of DNA that continues from 21 all the way to this day. That DNA is quite simple. It is the Leninist notion of a monopoly over power. Power should not be shared. And it is a Marxist commitment to control over the means of production. And that has not changed either. So when we sometimes talk about China the last 10 or 20 years as being somehow capitalist, it is not. Means of production belong to the state. The land belongs to the state. Most capital belongs to the state. Means of production generally belong to the state. And that's the great genius of Deng Xiaoping and his followers, is to have rectified that whole economy in such a way that they can stay in charge while still controlling the whole thing.
Quick cultural note here. When I hear him describes the DNA, the consolidation of power, and the means of production is controlled by the state, you know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like the dynasty. Maybe that's why they marry so well together, because we already had thousands of years of history with emperors. And emperors, well, they control means of production. For thousands of years, emperors after emperors, they perfected this. They perfected the consolidation of power. So it just sounds to me, with my cultural background, sounds like a modernized version of what our people is used to.
Deng Xiaoping put it very nicely. He called it capitalist tools in socialist hands. He said, we have nothing to fear from any of those foreigners and their ventures and their capital, because our socialist hands control it.
The most accurate definition at the end of the day comes from the CCP themselves, I guess. I will say that at some point the balance has been broken. You know, one of the problems of allowing the free run of capitalism in a non-capitalist society is at some point you reach your limit, and I think that's what we're witnessing now. Even though the Chinese Communist Party never once wanted to share its power, never wanted to have a political reform, years of economic reforms will lead to political reform. You either have to stop this economic reform in its track before you are forced to share power, or you let history take its course. And we all know what the Chinese Communist Party is going to choose.